Welcome to this video on Aristotelianism. I'm Andrew Chapman. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'll be your guide. In addition to this video, I've also created a handout covering the content of the video. A link to the handout is available in the video description. It may be helpful to have this handout in front of you as you watch the video. And now on to Aristotelianism. Aristotelianism is a wide-ranging philosophical tradition rooted in the teachings and works of Aristotle, an ancient Greek thinker whose influence on Western thought rivals that of his own teacher, Plato. While Plato championed a vision of reality that emphasized transcendent forms, Aristotle grounded his inquiries in the observation of the natural world. He wrote extensively on metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, astronomy, and logic, forging systems of thought that flourished for centuries in various cultural and intellectual contexts. Through carefully structured arguments and a methodical approach to classifying phenomena, Aristotle sought to understand both the particularities of everyday life and the underlying causes or reasons that shape existence. From medieval university curricula to modern debates in ethics, his influence remains potent, illustrating how one philosopher's quest for systematic knowledge can reshape entire fields of inquiry. Despite living more than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle's legacy endures because of his insistence that human beings possess the capacity to know the world through empirical observation and reasoned analysis. He authored treatises on subjects as diverse as zoology, rhetoric, and political organization, establishing the foundations of academic disciplines that continue to this day. His style of systematic investigation, combining data collection with logical inference, would become emblematic of a broader Aristotelian tradition that was preserved, transformed, and at times challenged in a range of historical contexts, including the Islamic Golden Age and medieval Europe. Aristotle was born in Stagira in 384 BCE and traveled to Athens to study at Plato's academy, where he spent around 2 decades absorbing the dialogues and doctrines of his celebrated mentor. Over time, however, he developed a perspective distinct from Plato's, most notably on the status of universal concepts. Where Plato believed that forms, or ideas, exist in a separate realm, Aristotle argued that universals are embedded in the objects of this world and can be discerned by examining those objects themselves. This emphasis on immanence over transcendence underpinned his later efforts to classify living things, analyze political systems, and unravel the workings of the cosmos. Later in life, Aristotle became tutor to Alexander the Great, exposing him to court life and the political realities of an empire in the making. Eventually, Aristotle returned to Athens to found his own school, the Lyceum, which became famous for its peripatetic mode of study, where teacher and students engaged in walking discussions on topics ranging from ethics to biology. By collecting and categorizing extensive natural and social data, Aristotle aspired to build a comprehensive understanding of the world's interconnected phenomena. This rigorous observation-based methodology established a precedent that would influence generations of scholars who recognized in Aristotle's work a model for structured inquiry that could encompass nearly every field of knowledge. Following Aristotle's death in 322 BCE, his works were edited, preserved, and at times lost or rediscovered, leading to a rich history of interpretation. Within the ancient Greek world, successors at the Lyceum debated and expanded his theories. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars such as Avicenna and Averroes interpreted Aristotle's writings in dialogue with Islamic theology, merging rational analysis with spiritual questions. Their commentaries transmitted and transformed Aristotelian ideas, presenting them in ways that significantly shaped both medieval Jewish and Christian thought. During the medieval period in Latin Christendom, Aristotle's works became a cornerstone of university education. Thinkers such as Maimonides, writing in a Jewish context, and Thomas Aquinas, immersed in the Christian tradition, took Aristotle's categories of being, knowledge, and morality and harmonized them with theological doctrines. Aquinas, for example, built a comprehensive synthesis, where Aristotle's notions of form and matter dovetailed with arguments about God's nature, creation, and the moral life. This scholastic project dominated European universities for centuries, ensuring that Aristotelian texts remained a central source for discussions about everything from natural philosophy to the nature of the soul. Aristotelianism rests on several philosophical insights articulated in Aristotle's extensive corpus. One fundamental concept is the idea that concrete substances such as animals, plants, or inanimate objects like tables possess inherent essences or forms that define their nature. Rather than proposing a separate, heavenly realm of forms, Aristotle argued that universals are discernible within particular objects. This stance positioned him to investigate how substances come to be, how they maintain their identity over time, and how they fulfill their potentialities. His doctrine of the four causes or four reasons, the material, formal, efficient, and final, represents a defining feature in his metaphysical outlook. In analyzing any entity or event in asking what is this and what does it do, Aristotle explored what it is made of, how its form organizes it, what processes brought it about, and what purpose or end it serves. This framework, though modified over time, persisted as a powerful explanatory tool in natural science and philosophy. Beyond metaphysics, Aristotle's ethical theory, especially as presented in the Nicomachean Ethics, introduced the concept of virtue as a mean between extremes, coupled with the view that eudaimonia, often translated as rational flourishing or happiness, is achieved through the rational cultivation of virtuous habits. Underlying these ethical arguments is the conviction that human beings, as rational animals, fulfill their purpose by developing and exercising reason in a moral and intellectual context. Although some of Aristotle's scientific assertions, such as his geocentric model of the universe, have been supplanted by modern discoveries, his methods and certain philosophical insights remain salient. Students of ethics continue to find inspiration in his virtue-centered approach, which focuses on character development and moral dispositions rather than on strict rules like Kantianism does, or the calculation of outcomes like utilitarianism does. This view has a strong presence in current ethical discussions, where questions arise about the cultivation of personal integrity and the role that virtue plays in public life. In political theory, Aristotle's notion that the state exists primarily to foster the good life for its citizens resonates with ongoing debates about government responsibilities, citizenship, and the moral or educational functions of civic institutions. His observations on different regimes, from monarchies to democracies, and his emphasis on a constitution that promotes a balanced middle class remain relevant for those who analyze modern political structures. Moreover, his conviction that governance should cultivate rational virtues underlines broader conversations about the role of education and moral formation in shaping a stable society. Among Aristotelians themselves, debates have often centered on how to reconcile Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation with the philosophical or theological commitments that later interpreters brought to his texts. In the Middle Ages, for instance, Christian Aristotelians such as Aquinas wrestled with whether Aristotle's view of an eternal cosmos could fit with the doctrine of creation. In the Islamic world, thinkers worked to clarify whether Aristotle's understanding of the first mover contradicted the Quranic interpretation of God's active involvement in the world. These discussions produced diverse interpretations of Aristotle's original intent and illuminated how robust a framework Aristotelianism provided for addressing theological and metaphysical questions. Debates have also surrounded Aristotle's categorization of substances. Some interpreters saw his distinctions as too rigid or insufficient to explain emergent phenomena. Others questioned whether his notions of essence and potentiality leave enough room for modern scientific discoveries that point to dynamic processes rather than static forms. Consequently, certain Aristotelians embraced more flexible models, revising Aristotle's categories to accommodate new data. Others defended the stability of his account on philosophical grounds, claiming that the recognition of inherent essences does not preclude a complex, evolving natural environment. Aristotelianism has faced notable criticisms throughout its long history. External critics include the proponents of modern science, who challenged many aspects of the Aristotelian worldview, especially when Galileo's observations and later Newton's physics proved inconsistent with fundamental Aristotelian notions about celestial orbs and the nature of motion. Enlightenment thinkers, suspicious of scholastic methods, argued that the Aristotelian tradition sometimes obscured empirical realities beneath overly abstract speculation. They contend that Aristotle's emphasis on final causes, or telos, failed to mesh with the mechanistic worldview emerging in early modern science. In response, contemporary Aristotelians often focus on the conceptual components of Aristotle's philosophy that remain compelling, such as his logic, his attention to causality, and his virtue ethics. They emphasize that while Aristotle's specific cosmological claims have become outdated, his broader approach to systematic inquiry and explanation retains its value. Defenders note that Aristotle's teleological language can be interpreted in ways that do not conflict with modern scientific theories. For instance, they suggest a more modest reading of final causes, viewing them as explanatory tools to understand biological functions, or as a way of describing how human beings pursue rational goals in an ethical or political context. In this manner, many aspects of the Aristotelian tradition are seen as adaptable rather than irrevocably bound to ancient assumptions. Aristotle's influence extends to fields as varied as law, literary criticism, and environmental ethics. In the legal domain, his emphasis on the cultivation of virtue and the distinction between what is just by nature and just by convention informs ongoing discussions about the philosophical underpinnings of law. His work on rhetoric remains central to studies of persuasion and argumentation, guiding theorists who seek to understand how language shapes attitudes and decisions. In literary criticism, some interpret Aristotle's Poetics as a foundational text for analyzing narrative structure, tragedy, and the emotional impact of drama on audiences. Modern bioethics also finds inspiration in Aristotelian principles, especially concerning questions about the potentiality of human life, the importance of rational function, and the cultivation of virtues in medical practice. His hierarchical view of living things, while dated in certain respects, prompts reflection on what it means to flourish as a human or alternatively non-human organism, and on how moral considerations emerge from the specific capabilities of various forms of life. Because Aristotle explored relationships among ends, means, and the excellence inherent in particular activities, his thought lends itself to nuanced discussions about responsibility, agency, and well-being, whether one is analyzing clinical decisions or broader public health policies. In modern scholarship, Aristotelianism is often encountered in two principal arenas: ethical and political philosophy on the one hand, and the philosophical underpinnings of science on the other. Many ethicists champion virtue ethics as a robust alternative or complement to consequentialist and deontological frameworks, citing Aristotle's insistence on habituation, moral character, and practical wisdom. His notion that virtues must be applied through prudential judgment resonates with discussions about moral pluralism and the complexities of real-world dilemmas. Philosophers of science sometimes turn to Aristotle's accounts of causation and explanation, noting that the concept of teleology need not be dismissed outright, but can be repurposed to describe systems where functions emerge. In addition, contemporary logicians study Aristotle's syllogistic logic as an early but enduring contribution to deductive reasoning. While modern logic has vastly expanded beyond his system, Aristotle's concise formulations remain an important chapter in the history of rational inquiry. As such, Aristotelianism endures not merely as a historical curiosity, but as an evolving intellectual resource that remains open to reevaluation and transformation. Aristotle's impact on the development of Western thought can scarcely be overstated. For centuries after his death, his works served as the standard texts in medieval universities across Europe, laying the groundwork for what became known as scholasticism. This blend of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology characterized the intellectual life of the Middle Ages, culminating in the theological and philosophical syntheses of figures like Thomas Aquinas. Simultaneously, in the Islamic world, Avicenna and Averroes brought Aristotelian logic and science to bear on theological debates, influencing generations of scholars in both East and West. These medieval engagements with Aristotle ensured that his heritage would persist through the Renaissance and beyond, albeit subjected to reevaluations when experimental science began to supplant certain Aristotelian doctrines. Despite the challenges posed by modernity, Aristotle's systematic approach, concern for causality, and nuanced understanding of ethics continued to exercise a profound pull on thinkers. The resurgence of interest in virtue ethics in the 20th century, championed by philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre, showcased the enduring appeal of an ethical framework rooted in character and practical wisdom. MacIntyre's insistence that moral thought reflects a notion of the good, anchored in tradition-bound context, resonates directly with Aristotle's belief in the necessity of a shared conceptual framework to guide human flourishing. Through these continuities, Aristotle's legacy remains a living force in philosophical discourse, shaping debates that address fundamental questions about knowledge, morality, and the structure of reality. In conclusion, Aristotelianism is at once an ancient philosophical system and a continuously evolving tradition, capable of adapting to new intellectual and cultural currents. Aristotle's original writings, shaped by rigorous observation and guided by a search for systematic explanation, laid the groundwork for centuries of research into the nature of reality, the moral life, and the organization of political communities. While modern science has called into question some of his specific claims, much of his methodology, especially his logical analyses and interpretive frameworks, continue to influence disciplines such as ethics, law, rhetoric, and biology. Far from being confined to historical interest, Aristotelian principles maintain relevance in contemporary discussions about how best to understand the world and how to lead lives of rational self-fulfillment. Whether one is drawn to his emphasis on virtues, his account of causation, or his interest in the capacities that define living beings, the Aristotelian tradition offers a valuable lens through which to navigate the complexities of human experience. The enduring conversation around his ideas, from medieval scholasticism to modern virtue ethics, underscores the vitality of an intellectual heritage that has shaped Western culture in profound ways, ensuring Aristotle's place as a perennial guide for those who seek both theoretical understanding and practical wisdom.